I thought love was about trust, until my fiancé slid a prenup across the table, smiling like it was no big deal. I swallowed my pride and signed, convincing myself it didn't matter. But when I accidentally stumbled upon a hidden savings account labeled emergency fund, I realized it wasn't for us, it was for him. A safety net, in case I wasn't worth the risk. This is a story of love, betrayal, and the moment I finally saw my worth. Before we get into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I used to believe love was the one thing you didn't have to question. If you had to start overthinking every detail, every motive, then what was the point? For 3 years, I thought I had that kind of love with Brandon. The kind people dream about, the kind that made other couples a little jealous. He was charming in an effortless way, never trying too hard, just confident, sure of himself. He could turn any stressful day into a joke, make any ordinary moment feel like something special. And I loved him for that. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party, one of those casual Saturday night gatherings where half the people were in pajamas, and the other half were trying too hard to impress someone. I was somewhere in the middle, wearing my favorite sweater, sipping a glass of cheap wine, and wondering how soon I could leave without being rude. Then Brandon walked in. He wasn't loud or showy, but he had this presence, the kind that made people turn their heads, even if they weren't sure why. He struck up a conversation with me about the dip selection, of all things. Within minutes, I was laughing. By the end of the night, I had given him my number. 3 years later, I was still laughing. Still sharing inside jokes, still having lazy Sunday mornings in bed, still believing he was my person. When he proposed, it felt perfect. We were on a weekend trip in the mountains, a little cabin getaway he had planned as a surprise. Just the two of us, no distractions. It was near sunset when he led me outside to a clearing, the sky painted in warm orange and pink. I remember the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. He pulled a ring from his pocket, the diamond catching the last bit of sunlight, and asked me to be his forever. I didn't hesitate. Of course, I said yes. Everything after that was a blur of happiness. We called our families, we celebrated with friends, we dove headfirst into wedding planning. I had always imagined getting married as this equal partnership, two people coming together, sharing everything, building something strong. At first, it seemed like that's exactly what we were doing. We talked about venues, guest lists, flowers, all the usual things. But then, little by little, Brandon started taking over certain parts of the planning. "Let me handle the budget," he'd say with that easy smile. "You've got enough on your plate." It seemed logical. He worked in finance, after all. Numbers were his thing. And I trusted him. But then came the prenup. I remember the exact moment he brought it up. We were sitting at the dining table, eating takeout, casually talking about wedding plans. Then, as if it were nothing, he slid a folder across the table. "Just something I think we should take care of before the wedding," he said, like he was handing me a dinner menu. I frowned, picking it up. My name was already printed on the first page. I flipped through it, my stomach tightening. A prenup. I looked up at him, waiting for an explanation. "It's just a precaution, babe," he said, sipping his drink like this was the most normal conversation in the world. "You'd do the same if you were in my position." I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke. But he was completely serious. We had never talked about this. Not once. I tried to keep my voice steady. A precaution for what? Brandon sighed like I was overreacting. "It's not about you. It's just smart. You know how these things go, sometimes marriages don't work out. This protects both of us." My hands tightened around the papers. I wasn't naive. I knew prenups were common, especially for people with significant assets. But we had always talked about marriage as a partnership, not a transaction. The idea of putting a legal safety net in place before we even said "I do" felt wrong. "You really think we need this?" I asked quietly. Brandon reached for my hand, giving it a squeeze. "It doesn't change anything between us. It's just a formality." A formality. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that signing this piece of paper didn't mean anything deeper. But deep down, something didn't sit right. I didn't sign the prenup that night. I told Brandon I needed time to think about it, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I saw something shift in his expression. Annoyance. Just for a second. Then, just as quickly, he covered it with a chuckle, shaking his head like I was being silly. Of course, babe. Take your time. I just figured you'd understand. Understand. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to understand. That he wanted to protect himself? That he saw marriage as a gamble? That, on some level, he was already considering the possibility of us failing? I barely slept that night. Lying next to Brandon, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I kept replaying our conversation. The ease in his voice when he slid that folder across the table. The way he expected me to agree without question. The way he reassured me it was just smart. I wanted to talk to someone, to hear an outside opinion that wasn't just my own emotions running in circles. So the next morning, I called Laura. She picked up on the second ring. Finally. I was starting to think you ran away to elope without me. I forced a laugh. Not exactly. The moment I told her about the prenup, the playfulness in her voice vanished. Wait. Back up. He just sprung this on you. Yeah, I admitted, rubbing my temple. Out of nowhere. Just bam, here's some legal paperwork before we get married. Laura swore under her breath. What the hell, Em? That's, wow. I don't like it. I let out a slow breath. I don't either. She didn't hesitate. Then don't sign it. It's not that simple, I muttered. He says it's just a precaution, that it doesn't mean anything. Laura made a noise that was somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. Yeah, for him. But what about you? What does it mean for you? I swallowed hard. That was the part one was struggling with. Because, on the surface, I knew what Brandon would say. He'd say I was overthinking it. He'd say it was normal, responsible, a simple business decision. But that was the problem. I didn't want my marriage to feel like a business decision. Laura sighed, her voice softer now. Look, I know you love him. But Em, if he really trusts you, why does he need a contract to protect himself from you? I didn't have an answer. Later that day, I went to see my mom. She had always been my voice of reason, my steady anchor. Growing up, she had raised me on her own, working 2 jobs, stretching every dollar to make sure I had everything I needed. To her, love had always been about showing up, through struggles, through uncertainty, through everything. When I told her about the prenup, she didn't react the way Laura did. No anger, no immediate judgment. Just a long, thoughtful pause. Then she said, "Pick your battles, sweetheart." I frowned. What do you mean? She stirred her tea, choosing her words carefully. Marriage isn't about the wedding. It's about the years after, the life you build together. If you love him, don't let a piece of paper ruin that. I felt a lump rise in my throat. But doesn't it mean he doesn't fully trust me? She sighed. Maybe. Or maybe it just means he's scared. Some people need security more than others. I sat with that for a while. Brandon wasn't a bad person. He had always been responsible, always cautious when it came to money. Maybe this wasn't about me. Maybe it was just how his brain worked, planning for the worst, just in case. That night, I called him into the living room. He was on his laptop, finishing up some work, but he shut it as soon as he saw my face. I've been thinking about it, I said, sitting down across from him. And I need to understand something. Brandon leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Okay. Ask me anything. I took a breath. Do you think we're going to make it? His brows pulled together. What? Our marriage. Do you believe in us? Do you believe we'll last? Brandon didn't hesitate. Of course. Then why the prenup? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not about us. It's just about being smart. Protecting ourselves. I searched his face, looking for any crack in his certainty. Any sign that he understood why this hurt me. But from what? From each other. He let out a soft chuckle. It's not like I ever plan on using it. It's just peace of mind. That's all. Peace of mind. For him. I sat there, weighing my options. I could fight him on this. I could make it a deal breaker, refuse to sign, force him to prove that he trusted me completely. But was that worth throwing away everything else we had? I loved him. I loved us. And so, in the end, I signed. Brandon kissed my forehead, relief clear in his voice. See? It's just business. We're still us. But the truth was, something had shifted. I had agreed to the prenup, but I wasn't sure we were still us at all. At first, I tried to move past it. I told myself that the prenup was just a formality, that it didn't change anything. That Brandon and I were still us. And for a while, it seemed true. We went back to wedding planning, picking out invitations, tasting cake samples, debating whether we should go with a live band or a DJ. Brandon was the same as ever, charming, confident, always ready with a solution whenever I started to feel overwhelmed. But every now and then, I'd catch myself hesitating before saying our future. It was subtle, just a flicker of doubt. Because in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had already built a door to escape. I didn't bring it up again. I wanted to believe that I was overthinking it, that the prenup wasn't a reflection of how he saw me. But then, I started noticing other things. It started small. One night, we were watching TV on the couch, my legs draped over his lap, when a commercial for some home loan company came on. I turned to him, smiling. You know, I was thinking, maybe after the wedding, we could start looking at houses? Brandon didn't even look away from the screen. Yeah, maybe. I waited for him to say more. He didn't. Maybe. I pressed. He sighed, shifting slightly. It's just, we don't need to rush into that, babe. Renting is fine for now. I frowned. I thought we agreed we wanted to build something together. A home. He finally glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Yeah, but buying a house is a big commitment. I opened my mouth to respond, but something about his tone stopped me. A big commitment. Bigger than, say, marriage? Again, I let it go. Then there were the financial conversations. Brandon had always been in charge of handling money. He was good at it, and I trusted him. But suddenly, I started noticing how often he shut down conversations about our finances. One Saturday, I was sorting through some wedding expenses when I casually asked, "Hey, should we set up a joint savings account for after the wedding?" He barely looked up from his phone. What for? I blinked. Savings? You know, for emergencies, future stuff. Brandon smirked. That's what my accounts are for. I tried to brush it off as him being practical. But something about the way he said my accounts instead of our accounts stuck with me. Then, there was the phone call. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, when I heard Brandon talking on the phone in his office. His voice was low, almost hushed. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except for what he said next. No, she doesn't know. I froze. There was a pause, then a chuckle. It's better that way. My grip on the glass tightened. I wasn't sure how long I stood there before Brandon walked out, still holding his phone. When he saw me, he smiled. Hey babe. Everything okay? I forced myself to sound normal. Who were you talking to? Just work stuff, he said easily. Boring finance talk. Something in me clenched. I had never been the jealous, paranoid type. I had never doubted Brandon before. But this felt like something different. I wanted to ask more. But I didn't. Because deep down, I was scared of what the answer might be. Instead, I pretended everything was fine. I went back to wedding planning. I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that I was just on edge because of the prenup. And then, I found the bank statement. It was a Sunday afternoon. Brandon was out golfing with his friends, and I had offered to organize some of his paperwork in his home office. He had always been a little messy with his files, and I figured I could at least sort them into some kind of system. That's when I saw it. A folded bank statement, half buried under a stack of old receipts. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, I glanced at the account name. Emergency Fund. I frowned, unfolding the paper. The balance was large. Much larger than I ever knew Brandon had in savings. Confused, I scanned for the date the account was opened. And that's when my stomach dropped. It had been created right after we got engaged. A lump formed in my throat as I stared at the numbers. This wasn't just a regular savings account. This was something else. Something private. Something secret. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was overthinking it. But deep down I knew. This wasn't just about finances. This was about trust. And I wasn't sure we had it anymore. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted to. I wanted to storm into the living room the moment he got home and throw the bank statement at him. But a small, shaky voice in my head whispered, "What if you're wrong? What if there's a perfectly reasonable explanation?" So, I waited. I spent the next few days in a strange, quiet haze, watching, listening, paying attention to things I had ignored before. The way Brandon always closed his laptop the moment I walked into the room. The way he dismissed my questions about finances with a quick, "Babe, you don't have to worry about that." The way he had built an entire safety net, just for himself, while telling me that we were a team. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I needed answers. So one night, over dinner, I asked, "Do we have a joint savings account?" Brandon was in the middle of cutting his steak. His knife paused for half a second, so quick I almost missed it. Then, he glanced up at me. "Why?" My stomach tightened. "Just wondering. I thought maybe we should start one, for emergencies." He shrugged, going back to his food. "I've got it covered." I swallowed. "With what?" "Your emergency fund." His knife stopped. There it was. The moment of hesitation. Brandon looked at me carefully, setting his fork down. "What are you talking about?" I took a slow breath. "I found the statement, Brandon. The account you opened right after we got engaged." For a second, he didn't say anything. Then, instead of looking guilty or caught, he just sighed. "Emily, it's not what you think." I forced myself to stay calm. "Then tell me what it is." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "It's just a backup plan." The words hit me like a slap. I blinked. "A backup plan?" Brandon exhaled. "Look, it's not a big deal. It's just smart. In case things don't work out." My chest felt tight. "Not a big deal?" My voice was quieter than I expected. "You planned an escape route before we even started?" His jaw tightened. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Brandon?" I felt my throat closing up, my hands shaking. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you don't actually trust me." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking frustrated. "Emily, this isn't personal. It's just responsible. You take insurance out on a car, right? You hope you never need it, but it's there." I stared at him, something inside me breaking. A car. That's what he was comparing our marriage to. An investment. Something he needed to protect himself from. My voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm not a car, Brandon." His expression hardened. "You're overreacting." I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. "Overreacting?" I gestured at the space between us. "Do you even hear yourself? You hid this from me. You're planning for this to fail." "I'm not," he stopped, rubbing his face in frustration. "Look, Emily. This is how I think. I like having things in order. I like knowing that if something goes wrong, I won't be left with nothing." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "But I would." Silence. Brandon didn't deny it. He didn't say no, of course not. He just looked at me, expression unreadable. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The prenup wasn't just a precaution. The savings account wasn't just smart planning. Brandon had never truly been all in with me. He had always been preparing for an out. I had spent 3 years loving this man, trusting him, planning a future with him, while he had spent that same time making sure he wouldn't lose too much if I left. Or worse, if he left me. A deep, painful ache spread through my chest. I had convinced myself for weeks that the prenup didn't mean anything. That money didn't matter. That love was more important. But this wasn't about money. This was about trust. And Brandon had never truly trusted me. I pushed my chair back slowly, standing up. Brandon frowned. "Emily." "I need some air," I said, my voice quiet. He sighed, rubbing his temple again. "Babe, you're making this bigger than it needs to be." I looked at him, really looked at him. At the man I thought I knew. And I felt sick. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and walked out the door. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I was coming back. I walked for what felt like hours. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were too loud. I replayed every moment of our relationship, trying to find the exact point when I had missed the signs. Had it been when he brushed off my questions about money? When he told me he had everything handled? Or had it been even earlier, when I mistook his confidence for security, his control for care? Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that love meant trusting blindly. But trust was supposed to go both ways. And Brandon had never trusted me. Not with his fears. Not with his worries. Not with his future. The weight of it settled in my chest like a stone. I had spent so much time proving I was worthy of commitment, when the truth was, I had never needed to. He was the one who should have been proving himself to me. I didn't know how long I stood outside our apartment door when I finally made it back. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Inside was the life I had built with Brandon. The man I had loved. The wedding we had planned. But I already knew. I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry someone who loved me conditionally. Someone who had built an escape route while telling me we were in this together. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and stepped inside. Brandon was on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up. "You done being dramatic?" Something inside me hardened. I had spent years putting him first. Making sure I didn't upset him, that I didn't push too hard, that I didn't ask for too much. But I wasn't going to do that anymore. "I'm leaving," I said simply. Brandon let out an incredulous laugh. "What?" I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "I can't marry someone who sees me as a risk instead of a partner." He set his phone down, rubbing his forehead. "Emily, come on. We had a fight. That's all this is." I shook my head. "No, Brandon. This is a wake-up call." He sighed heavily. "You're really going to throw everything away over a bank account?" I looked at him, my chest tight. "I'm not the one who threw this away," I said softly. "You did." For the first time, his expression shifted. For a moment, just a brief moment, I saw something crack behind his eyes. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was realization. Or maybe, it was just the weight of losing something he thought would always be there. I turned before I could second-guess myself. I packed in silence, my hands steady even as my heart ached. Brandon didn't try to stop me. And somehow that hurt the most. The first few weeks were hard. I woke up in an unfamiliar apartment, in a bed that wasn't ours. I caught myself reaching for my phone to text him before remembering that there was nothing left to say. I missed him. Not just the idea of him. I missed our inside jokes. I missed the way he made coffee exactly how I liked it. I missed the version of him I had believed in. But I didn't miss the doubt. I didn't miss the feeling of walking on eggshells around conversations that should have been easy. And I didn't miss the part of me that had slowly shrunk in order to fit into the version of love he was willing to give. So, I let myself grieve. And then slowly, I started to heal. I went back to doing things I loved. I surrounded myself with friends who reminded me of who I was before him. I built a life that wasn't about waiting for someone else to choose me. And one day, I woke up and realized. I didn't regret leaving. The prenup, the secret savings account, those weren't just about money. They were proof that Brandon had never been ready to fully commit. And I deserved more than that. So to anyone out there who's ever questioned if they're asking for too much, if they're overreacting, if they should just accept the bare minimum, this is your reminder. Real love doesn't come with an exit strategy.